Hi, it's Steph. Have you tried winter sowing before but haven't had success with it? Well, today we're going to go over some FAQs and I'm going to answer the most frequently asked questions in my comments regarding the winter sowing process. Knowing when to start your seeds is probably the most important thing that you'll need to figure out when starting your winter sowing. It's really going to be largely dependent on what zone you garden in and which seeds you want to start. So once you figure out those two things, you can take to Google and do a little bit of research and sort of figure out when the best time it is for you to start your seeds that you're looking to grow. I'm in Massachusetts in zone 6B. I like to start my seeds in February. We have a winter here with some cold weather, and so I usually start in February with my perennials, which usually benefit from a period of cold stratification. So today I'm doing my first batch of seeds and I'm doing some perennials as well as onions. And then what I'll do is in March, I will start any spring vegetables that are cool weather vegetables. Some examples of that would be kale. I might even start cilantro, which is a cool weather herb. And you can start some cool weather annual flowers, things like snapdragons or bachelor buttons. And then finally, you want to wait until you are closer to your last frost date in order to start any tender annuals, things like marigolds, cosmos, or zinnias, even sunflowers. Those you would wait until only a couple of weeks before your last frost date to start them in your containers. Because if you do get zapped with a little bit of a late season frost, you don't want to risk losing those tender annuals. So that is the important thing. Your first step is going to be proper planning. Which seeds am I starting? What gardening zone am I in? And when will it be appropriate for me to start my winter sowing? And that is going to be very individual because it's largely dependent on what you're growing and where you're located. So I have had this experience myself. When I start containers, you have to make sure that you have proper drainage in your containers. It's important because if your containers can't drain, your container will get waterlogged, which may cause your seeds to rot before they even have a chance to germinate. The other failure point that I've noticed is that the container is the opposite of being waterlogged. It gets too dried out. So if you happen to have a season where you're not getting a lot of rain, or maybe you live in an area that doesn't get snow, those are the two best ways for your containers to get watered once you put them outside. So if you're not getting that type of weather and you're going long stretches of dry weather, you will have to supplement your containers with some water. Now, you don't want to use a watering can that has a very hard stream, because what will happen is if you go into the top of your container and use that watering can with a very strong stream, you could knock your seeds out of place and it just may not help your seeds germinate. So what I always recommend is either using a watering can that has like a rain type head, or even a spray bottle, because if you spray a mist into your container, that will be the most gentle way to water those seedlings in and to provide additional moisture. Sealing your container. Make sure that your tape is adhering well and making a good seal with no air pockets. I found duct tape to be one of the best for this purpose. So that is another tip. Make sure that you seal your containers properly to keep the condensation building in the container and not letting it escape, causing your containers to dry out. Another common failure point when starting your seeds is not planting them to the proper depth. Now, I've been very guilty of this in the past. When you read the seed packet instructions, they're typically really good about describing, at least to some extent, how deep the seeds should be planted. And so sometimes they'll say plant to a depth of 1/4 inch. And so typically those are with larger seeds. They'll require that you have to plant them a little bit deeper and put some soil to cover them. And so in that case, that's usually pretty easy to know what to do. But it gets a little tricky when they say something like seeds need light to germinate. In that case, all you're doing is taking the seed packet and you're sprinkling it on top of the soil, using the pads of your fingertips to just lightly press it into the soil so that the seeds make contact, and then use a very light mist, like something from a water bottle, to finish watering those in so that they don't move. Needs light to germinate, to me now is the easiest because you just sprinkle them on top, pat them in, like I said, spray them, and they are good to go. Another failure point could be not giving your containers enough sun. So winter sowing needs water, it needs light, proper growing conditions. So what you want to do is you want to find a place to put your winter sowing containers that is going to both receive rain or snow and sunlight. You don't want to place your winter sowing containers close to the house under the eaves. I've seen people do that before too, and what that will do is prevent the moisture from getting into your containers. So if you have them under an overhang, they're not going to get watered. So that's very important. Make sure that you place them in an area that's nice and open. And something else that I only sort of came across last year and learned from this experience, I was placing my winter sowing containers on top of the soil on my raised beds. What was happening is after my seedlings germinated and started to grow, I was having slug damage, and it took me a little bit to figure out what was going on. I actually had to open up one of my winter sowing containers to inspect, and that's when I figured it out. The slugs that were in my raised garden beds in the soil were climbing up through the drain holes and were damaging my seedlings in my winter sowing containers. So what I have found is that for me, it is better for me to place my winter sowing containers on the gravel that I have inside my vegetable garden instead of placing the winter sowing containers on top of the soil in the raised beds. So something to keep in mind if you are going to place your seedlings or in your winter sowing containers out in the garden, you want to just try to put them in a spot that you would have good drainage and that also could potentially prevent slugs from getting in. Let's talk about some additional things that you need to be aware of when you're using the winter sowing method. Now, if you are in an area that's a little bit warmer, say like a zone 8 or so, and you've already experienced some germination in your winter sowing containers, you will have to keep an eye out on the forecast. If you get a freaky frost, you're going to get a couple of days of really low temperatures and you're going into a frost situation, but you already have germinated seedlings in your winter sowing containers. You will have to protect those seedlings because in most cases the seedlings are not frost hardy, and so if you leave them unprotected, you really could risk losing your seedlings. So what you can do is, if you have these things on hand, a piece of burlap, even a fleece blanket or old sheet that you don't use, you'll want to huddle all your containers together, kind of bundle them up, and just throw this blanket or piece of burlap over them to offer some protection from the frost temperatures, at least until that cold snap passes. And then you want to immediately uncover them so that they can continue to get sunlight and water from the elements. Now, what happens if you get unseasonably warm temperatures and you have seedlings in your winter sowing containers? So in this instance, when you have exceptionally warm temperatures, you need to give them some breathing room. You need to give them some air, and you need to cool off that container by opening it up. What do you do once that really warm weather has passed, but you're not quite ready to plant them out yet? Well, you don't have to seal your container back up. You can just close the flap back over. However, you will have to provide supplementary water because you no longer have that seal on your container creating condensation. Your containers will be more likely to dry out. So if you're not getting rain, you will have to water those seedlings regularly to keep them moist until you are ready to plant them out in the garden. I hope that these tips have helped you with some of the questions that you may have regarding the winter sowing process. It really is a very successful process for the most part, and I enjoy it quite a lot. Some other things that you'd want to think about if you are going to start setting up your containers, it can get quite messy. So I found a tarp that I'm going to use to put all of my supplies on. You also want to have some kind of container that you can put the winter sowing container that you're working on inside to catch any excess water that's going to drain from that container while you're doing your setup. Those are just some tips that I have, and if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. This will probably be my last winter sowing video until I show you the results in the spring. So I hope that you've enjoyed. Thank you for hanging out with me, and I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please hit the thumbs up button, and please consider subscribing so you don't miss any of my future videos. And we'll see you soon.